I welcome new members from the Women's Festival. I hope that everybody managed to get here who was coming. Oh, okay. Okay, so welcome, and I'll just introduce by name the people who are in front of you. My name is Shelley Stickel-Miles, and I have on my far right Remi De Roo and Lois Wilson and Tish Lakes and Premika Ratnam and Vicki Obedkoff at the end of the table. And they're all speaking on the culture of patriarchy. We'll start with Lois.
I'm very glad that this is on the program under Changing Our Ways of Thinking, Global Concerns. This kind of session is often labeled women's issues or women's concerns, and the women turn up and that's it. But this summer I had the chance of leading a seminar in Switzerland between Christian and Jewish women to really line up the agenda for the coming decade, sort of. And finally, one of the Jewish women said, why don't we stop fooling around and name it and call it what it is, which is the culture of patriarchy. So I think that most of us recognize that we participate in such a culture, and we would recognize it mostly by the way it has touched us or the way it manifests itself. We're able to do that and recognize that more by the way it shows itself than, I'm talking too loud. I got an outdoor voice, sorry about that. We recognize it more by the manifestations. We can describe it more than we can define it. And I think that's all right. Let me begin by saying I'm supposed to lay a bit of the groundwork here for the others to be more specific. For example, in the religious communities, in the Judaic Christian communities, I think the examples are rather obvious. First of all, the language and the symbols of liturgy, particularly around the images of God, have come through the male prism. And the contribution of women has been hidden in that area. I mean, I've seen, I don't know how many stained glass windows with God is like a shepherd, but in that same chapter it says God is like a woman sweeping, looking for a lost coin, but I've never seen that enshrined in a stained glass window yet. So it's there, it just is hidden or lost or not lifted up. The theology that comes out of Christian community has come out mostly out of male experience, and so women have not been prominent in either shaping the images or the theological thinking. Paul, for example, never mentioned that women were first at the tomb to witness the resurrection. I don't know why he forgot to mention that. The spirit ruah, or wisdom, is female, but that's often lost as well. So a lot of theological concepts and biblical interpretations we have lost. In terms of women's participation, we know that the churches are full of women, but there are very, very few in decision-making, in the decision-making possibilities of the churches. So part of what we're about is to challenge a tradition that is exclusive. Now, I've mentioned some of the things within the Christian community. However, there is also the situation of women in society, where I think the statistics I've got are that 50% of the human race are female, 33% of the labor force are female, they earn 60% of what men earn, 10% of them are beaten by their male partners, and they own 1% of the property. Now, I think that's an example of structural injustice. It's not discrimination, it's not prejudice, it's built into the system which we apparently live under. There's also the business of the marginalization of women, which is so well documented by many of our female writers in Canada, Alice Munro, Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood, and so on. And I think that marginalization can't be overcome without examining why this has happened, what are the roots of marginalization, which leads us to the whole subject of the culture of patriarchy. Also to add that part of the secular manifestation of it is something we call the feminization of poverty, the fact that so many people who are poor happen also to be women for a number of reasons which we need to analyze. I worked for the Ontario Human Rights Commission for a year, which enforces legislation against those who discriminate against others on the basis of race or sex and so on. And I got very tired sitting across from managers who said the reason they don't hire women in their plant is that they don't have a washroom for them. Never occurred to them that they could build a washroom. I'm going to attempt, it's somebody else's definition of patriarchy, which seems safe enough. So this is the definition which I've got from a book. Betty Reardon is the author. Patriarchy is a set of beliefs and values supported by institutions and sometimes backed by the threat of violence. It lays down supposedly proper relationships between men and women, between women, and between men and men. It imposes structures which make some work naturally men's work and others work naturally women's work. And it gives whatever is men's work more value, more significance, more pay. Patriarchy tries to divide women among themselves by asserting that each woman should see her greatest loyalty, protection, self-identification lodged in her relationship with a man. And I think it is true that for many of us, we certainly learned that our identity is derived from either our father, our brother, our husband. Lois, even in the New Testament, is identified as Timothy's grandmother. Now, so patriarchy, in my view, is a worldview which supports an arrangement that makes some women, usually women, some people, usually women, dependent on others, usually men, although not always, for economic, political, and cultural well-being. It's a worldview that many find no longer acceptable, and it is, in my view, a contradiction of the gospel. It is a hierarchy, I think, of values, responsible for not only distortion in human relationships, but for many of the ecological disasters. In the hierarchy, it's the kind of hierarchy which has legitimized the values of authority, of domination of one by the other, of aggression, of violence, which is very often sanctioned to keep things in order. And although not all men are part of that system nor by it, thank goodness, not all women escape its values. In fact, I would think it would be the exceptional woman who has not been part of that. So it's these cultural values that have generally shaped our thinking, our language, our behavior in the workplace, in the religious community, and in human relationships. They are the kind of relationships, for example, that are very popular with the military. I remember watching a show on TV one night on the training of the military, where it became obvious that soldiers were trained to look upon the enemy, the other human, as an object, and not to think of them as a human being. And my daughter, who is a doctor, said, "Isn't that interesting? That's precisely what our training was as doctors. Think of that person as a liver, not as a human being. Because if you don't, you'll get too far in." All right, that is not a value that I think is a gospel value. However, I think that we're living in a very exciting time now, because it is a time when women particularly are able to have access to the knowledge of the centuries, which has been lost for so long, and now we are becoming part of the audible, visible history of the world, reclaiming our own history and the history of women throughout the ages. We have been kind of figuratively bent over, as the gospel story talks about the bent over woman, but we are now being unbent and being healed historically and telling a new story. I mean, some of the old story in our tradition, in our cultural tradition, is pretty horrifying. You know, sugar and spice and everything nice, that's what little girls are made of. And that's what you're supposed to be, sugar and spice, sweet. But for men, it's snakes and snails and puppy dogs' tails. Yeah, you're under no obligation to be sweet to anyone. And that's very much into our, and you take in English common law the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb, no man was allowed to beat the woman he was living with a switch wider than the rule of thumb. I mean, this is in our cultural tradition. So, and I'm not laying blame here, I'm simply saying that as a cultural tradition, it is part of our inheritance that we have to deal with. Women are more and more now beginning to understand that they have been the victims of much of this because of the cultural thing. And I brought along something that I'll leave in the back table, which some of you may know about. It is the sculpture of the crucified woman, which was done by a German Canadian. Was mounted on Easter Sunday in Bloor Street United Church in Toronto some years ago, practically caused a riot. So it was taken down and put in at the back of the church. This woman is not on a cross, but she is in the position of crucifixion. And it is a very powerful sculpture, which now is mounted in front of Emmanuel College, the United Church Theological College in Toronto. But it does say that many women are feeling crucified, like have known what that feels like, and are able to articulate that in a way that they have not previously. Just a couple more. Have I got a couple more minutes? Yeah. Oh, good. 2, eh? Around refugees, the Danish government has made interventions to the UN Convention on Refugees to ask that one of the bases for being a refugee is that you are persecuted on the basis of sex. That is not included at the present time. But the experience is that women are being persecuted and therefore are valid refugees, either because the man they're living with flees to the mountains, and so to punish the man, they rape the woman, because after all, the woman is his possession, and is to get back at the man, the woman is punished in that way. Or the woman is abused sexually as punishment for perhaps her own political activity. And at the present time, that is not a ground for being a refugee. I mean, she would have to have some other basis, but the Danes are trying to get that in. Well, I think that the culture of patriarchy has much to look at in terms of how we understand power, what power is. Traditionally, women have shied away from power, or said that's not nice, that has nothing to do with us, when in fact we used manipulative power. We learned it from our mother's knee. I hated to give it up when I became a feminist because I was so good at it. But you know what I mean. I can tell by your laughter, you women. You learned the same thing, how to go around, over, under, or through. And we knew the techniques. So that women as well as men need to really think about power and what that is. Power is the ability, the possibility of getting something done. It is not a negative. But what is the theology of power, and how is that responsibly used in our situation? Another question is the question of authority, whether it will be from above in a hierarchical system or whether it will have some circular elements. Where do we get our identity as human beings? What is our theology of the holy? What is our image of God? What is our method of coming to some of those conclusions? So that perhaps will introduce the subject. I've got lots more here, but I'm going to stop.
That everyone, except myself, speaks, really. And then we'll have a time for clarification. And then we go off into small groups. And then come back with a question, one main question from each group, and one main comment. And that's collated before we get together. And those questions are addressed. Okay, sorry for not announcing that. And Remi.
Lois has given us what I think is a brilliant survey of the outlines of the problem. I would like to share with you some of the areas that I have been obliged to delve into to try to come to grips with this question of patriarchy and the culture of patriarchy. And very, very briefly, here is what I have discovered. First of all, I've been forced to go back to the field of biology and recognize that contemporary biology has proven scientifically that our cultural assumptions about gender and about the sexes are totally inadequate because based on faulty biology. The example of that, of course, is one of the greatest classic theologians, Thomas Aquinas, whose concept of woman was that of the misbegotten male. In other words, nature really tried to produce a man, and when it didn't succeed, it ended up with a woman. Well, biology has turned that exactly upside down by establishing factors like the following. First of all, that gender and sex, and I distinguish the two, are not finally established until well into the process. In other words, the fetus in the womb is not differentiated until at a very advanced stage, and previous to that very advanced stage could be either one, boy or girl. So that just blows out the window completely the biological misunderstandings, I was going to say misconception, misunderstandings on which our culture is based. Now, that's all being questioned today because we're moving into a very exciting time of history, which is the awakening of what the philosophers call the subject. In other words, historical consciousness. We are today conscious of who we are and how we shape our own history and of our responsibility as people before us never have. Yeah? Those people who think that yesterday was an ideal world, forget that. That people in the past just lived by common sense and transferred what appeared to be common sense into the realm of the religious, and as a result were very much slave to a lot of religious convictions that really were not founded because they had not developed their critical self-reflective consciousness, which we have today. So we are now questioning much of that, and that means that we're re-examining our own culture. By culture here, there's so many definitions of culture. I want to stay with what is a very basic and a very simple daily understanding of culture. I describe it this way: why we do what we do the way we do it. In other words, how we understand ourselves to be human beings. That's our culture. You know, we do certain things in a certain way, and we do it because that's the way we've been shaped. That's how we have expressed our self-understanding. Now, our religious beliefs of necessity pass through our culture for the simple reason that we have to use language. And it's very important to remember that, because our theology, in other words, the way we speak about the numinous, about the divine, about the transcendent, about the beyond, whatever you want to call that area that is beyond the human, is very much conditioned by our culture. And that's why today we need to re-examine this whole cultural thing that we refer to as patriarchy in that new light of the emerging historical consciousness. That has forced us to re-examine how we speak about the transcendent. In other words, theology. Theology, as you know, we all do theology, whether we like it or not. We need not be professional theologians. Theology, from its Greek origin, means words about God, words about the divine, words about the transcendent. So because we are transcendent by nature, we think of higher things, of ideals, we naturally do theology, all of us. But our words, the way we think about the transcendent, necessarily comes out of the experience. We cannot express that which we have not experienced. And we must never forget, and this is critical for any proper understanding of theology, or for that matter, or talking philosophy, making sense when we talk, when we reason. Never forget that we operate by analogy. In other words, when we use a word about a transcendent reality, say about God, what we say about God is true, but the dissimilarity is greater than the similarity. In other words, you can say God is Father, and it's true. But there's more difference than there is similarity. The same if you say God is Mother, or God is any number of things. God is kind, God is just. Yes, we have a right to use that human word, but we must never forget that the difference is even greater. And in that sense, it's just as true to say that God is not Father in the human sense, because God is beyond being Father. God is beyond any human concept. So that forces us to be very humble in what we say and in the way we listen to other people. Now, unconsciously, our faulty biological understanding of the human being developing into a culture that was very narrow, has expressed itself in faulty theology that has in turn misinterpreted many of the fundamental things that we learned, say, from the scriptures. And that's why today we're being forced, thanks in good part to feminism, to re-examine even the way we read the scriptures and even the way the scriptures were written. Because here again, the people who put the scriptures down in writing were using the culture of their day and the language of their day, and were necessarily expressing themselves out of the experience they had. So scripture scholars are proving more and more that there's already a patriarchal culture which was prevalent at the time the scriptures were put in writing that has instilled itself into the very way the scriptures are written, which explains somewhat what Lois was saying earlier, that many of the values that today we are seeing there that are really in the scriptures were never brought out. And Lois pointed to the fact that the artists, for instance, have not raised out of the scriptures many things that are really there. So there are scripture scholars today who are re-examining the scriptures, first of all, to show how the very way they are written is already, in a sense, filtered through a lens, and also how there are many things in the scriptures that are really there, but we've never paid attention to. For instance, when Genesis tells us the Creator made human beings male and female, we immediately apply our Western culture either or, and we think, well, he either made men or women. And that's not what the scripture says. Because if you rethink what the scriptures are saying, you will remember that the revelation there is that both of those qualities, male and female, are gifts from the Creator and are in every human being. You see what that does in terms of changing our understanding completely. Consequently, the complete human being is not either or, male or female. The complete human being has both of those. You see how we can rethink the scriptures, and then we begin to see that we have to rethink also and start to apply more effectively the whole question of Galatians 3:28. In Christ there is neither male nor female. And this is my closing thought because I've only got 13 seconds left. We have to be very, very careful that we don't abstract one quality from God and then make that an absolute, because then we fall into nothing less than idolatry. And this is why this whole question of the culture of patriarchy is so emotionally laden and so threatening to people. Because when we think it through, we really have to ask ourselves if many of the things that we've been saying in the name of religion are not actually idolatrous. For instance, if we're not careful and try to equate God with either sex, that's actually idolatry. You cannot equate God with one human characteristics. And that just to show that we've got a lot of homework in front of us.
Thank you.
Premika. Okay, I'm a filmmaker and not really accustomed to speaking in public, so I may not be that eloquent. There are a couple of points I would just like to add in terms of what had been said. Just in terms of information, Studio D is making a film called Women in Spirituality, which is looking at the historical gods and goddesses, particularly the female gods that have been forgotten with the rise of Christianity that were there before, I guess, 2,000 years ago. The other point was to take, there's another film called Soldier Girls, which looks at an all-women's unit, in the United States. I don't know whether it's going to come here, but if it does, you should take a look at it. Okay, in terms of patriarchy, I would like to take Dr. Wilson's definition one further, which is not only in terms of sex structure, but also that patriarchy provides lessons in terms of a class analysis and a class structure, by which I mean that it is not, historically men have been in a position of power and they have been in a position of exploitation, but with the structures as they exist now, women can exploit other women too, and that should not be forgotten. I would like to talk about India, which is where I grew up and I was educated there, and some of the experiences of both of rural women and of urban women in India. 70% of the women in India, and I think in a lot of economically exploited countries, there is a large percentage of the population is in the rural areas. The reality of patriarchy takes some very drastic and terrible forms. For the majority of the women, the average number of hours put in by women in the fields and doing work is approximately between 14 and 16 hours a day. And the majority of that time period is spent in preparing food, that is, collecting water, collecting firewood, and then cooking. The actual cooking only takes 10 to 20% of the time, and the 80% of the time is gathering firewood and collecting water. In areas which are like desert regions which do not have much water, or in the mountain regions, women can walk 10 to 20 kilometers a day looking for water. And with the increasing amount of deforestation that is taking place, partly because of the local population, but in India largely because of industrial development, women have to walk further and further away to collect water. And while the environment movement is thinking in terms of deforestation, they haven't recognized that as a women's issue, because the reality is that the women have to go and collect the firewood, the women have to go and find the water, and that aspect of it has been ignored until now. It's only now that there is sort of recognition of this aspect. I was doing a small survey in a city, small town in the hills called Kasauli, and there were villages scattered across the mountain of about, total population of all the villages was about 3,000, and they were existing in clusters of about 20, 30 families all across the mountainside. And I was talking to one of the many women, and they had about the same story. One of the women was 7 months pregnant, and she said that this is how she described her day, that she got up in the morning, she fed the children, she took care of the cattle, she fed the cattle, and her husband went to the town to work in a shop. And it was her job to collect the firewood, it was her job to go and get the water. She was 7 months pregnant, and she walked about 10 kilometers to get water 3 days every 4 days. So every fourth day she would not go, and she would be carrying on her head something between 20 and 30 kilograms of weight. And it was becoming increasingly more difficult for her, because this Kasauli is one of the earlier mountain ranges in the Himalayas, and it's brown and it's barren, and you really have to walk very far to get water. Right next to us, where we were talking, was a pipeline going right through the mountainside up to the city that was located on the top. It was a water line that was supplying water to the city, and the city people obviously didn't think it important enough to have a few outlets along the way so that the village people could have access to that water. And that was because the women were collecting the water, and it wasn't obviously a serious enough problem. But at the same time, I would also like to say that rural women are very resourceful, and they do not necessarily take everything lying down. One of the examples is in a state called Uttar Pradesh, in the Tehrai region. there was a movement which is probably a landmark in the history of the environment movement in India called the Chipko Andolan. And Chipko means to hug. That is, to hug. And this is the same problem was being faced by the women in this region. And the most recent occurrence was that a sports company was coming to cut down trees for manufacturing sports products, and this meant that they had to walk further and further to get firewood. They decided to form a group, and when the loggers came to cut down the trees, they chained themselves to the trees and they put their arms around it, and that way they provided a barrier preventing the loggers from cutting down the trees. And they did this for a couple of weeks. And then the loggers who had got a license to cut down the trees, because the Indian government thought that cutting down the trees would generate employment and therefore inject money into the economy and uplift the economy. So the loggers went back to the government, and the environment movement and the politicians and everybody came, and they have succeeded in preventing that area from being logged. And similar strategies, nonviolent strategies, are being done across India. This idea originated from illiterate, I guess academically uneducated women. And to follow up from that, the environmentalists came in and they shared information. They learned from the women what were their problems and what was their knowledge of the mountainside, the increase in flash floods, soil erosion, the effect on their crops, etc. So I think there is a lot that we can learn from women's experiences. Women are very close, the rural women in India are very close to the land. And, we can come with our lofty theories, from textbooks based on experiences in different situations, and there's may not be the best solutions for the women in India. Now, just in terms of some of the experiences of urban women, I guess some of you might have heard of the dowry system, which is similar to hope chests, I guess, in the West, which is that you bring, a certain number of goods as part of your trousseau to make up for your contribution to the family income. I mean, historically in India, it generated as something that was used to protect women in times of need. If her husband abandoned her, her husband died, she had these things that she could sell or fall back on. However, with the rise of the consumer movement, this was seen as an opportunity to buy a whole lot of goods, TV, fridges, and all sorts of dreams that you couldn't legitimately earn. It was seen as an opportunity to, acquire all these goods. And so women were always brought up not as individual people, but to be wives and mothers and daughters. And particularly, there's a phrase in Hindi called paraya dhan, which means borrowed wealth, and that a woman is being brought up basically to be married, which is when her life will begin. Of course, this has run into a lot of problems. This is, I guess, a cultural variation of wife abuse and exploitation of women. It leads to murder of women, and it's called by 60 Minutes and the sensational press as bride burning. Well, there are a lot of movements now, grassroots organizations that are fighting against it, trying to get the laws changed. But there are two things. One is getting legal systems changed, and the other is the self-esteem that the woman has. Now, I think that this is my own personal experience. I wouldn't like to represent the different women's groups in India. My personal feeling is that the urban movement in India is particularly bogged down by Western feminist literature because we are educated in English. We are all the time reading and studying Western concepts, Western ideas, and value systems, and it is very easy for us to learn about Western feminism. We probably know more about Western feminism than we have spent time developing our own concepts of what feminism is about. And I think that we need more time and more encouragement to develop our own concepts as to what we see as solutions and strategies for change. In terms, let me just refer to my notes some more. Yeah, just in terms as a filmmaker, that's one of the reasons why I went into filmmaking, was that I was tired of seeing technically well-produced films made by the BBC, etc., about people in India, and I wanted to make technically competent, extremely well-produced, with a sufficient budget films about what I thought about India and people not from India, everywhere else. Now that I have come to Canada, I have a male partner who is from India who works with me. We try to work as equal partners and work things out. Many of my films are on feminist issues. Currently, I'm making a film on non-white women, and a large part of the crew are women, and they often tend to feel a bit sorry for me sometimes. They're coming to save me from this patriarchal male, and bogged down by this male oppressor. He has a beard, and they often think he's a Turk, and he's the oppressor from an Islamic culture. There are other forms of that in Canada. I was working with a Chinese girl who said that she would never have a Chinese boyfriend because she thought he just wasn't attractive. And she chose a white boyfriend, the sort that she always does all the cooking in the house. She cleans the dishes. I've never seen him prepare a meal or even pick up his own clothes. And yet, she feels that there is something wrong with Chinese men. Let me see now. So that is, it takes all sorts of forms. There are also the problems in terms of the feminist movement. I think that on the one end, extreme, we have people who are bogged down by the peer pressure of the Western feminist movement and are not able to speak out as to what they feel and what choices they really want to have. I think one of the most tragic instances that I witnessed was a filmmaker friend of mine who has made some of the most outspoken feminist films and has done leading work in filmmaking in Canada, who's always runs home at 5 o'clock to welcome her husband, and she does all the cooking, the cleaning, and she invited me over for dinner, and she couldn't open a wine bottle because her husband always does that. Now, I think that people must be allowed to speak about how they want to lead their lives and what is the form of feminism they wish to adopt, and they should be able to speak about it in as unashamed terms as possible. I just wanted to give an example as a closing. Before I do that, I would just like to mention something about real women in Canada who I feel are afraid to face up to the realities of life. They are arguing in terms of that a woman's sphere of influence is at home and the men's sphere of influence is at work. And they should be, I don't think, just because of what I said, I don't want you to think that I buy into the argument of real women. I think that they prevent women from having choices. They prevent men from having the choice to be at home. Just as a closing note, I'd like to, it came out as a result of a discussion with Vicki this afternoon. I was just talking about my own father, and I thought I would mention that. He doesn't see himself as a feminist. My father is in India. Both my parents are in India. He doesn't see himself as a feminist. He probably hasn't heard of a lot of the prominent Western feminists in North America and etc. My mother worked in the evening 3 times in the week and at night too. And when we were small, he would do the cooking. He would help in the house. It was just done as a part of a daily chore. He didn't feel righteous, brave, or bold, or proud about it. And I would like to see that too in the general public. Thank you.
Is that loud enough? Is that better? Okay. I'd just like to give a little bit of background of my organization, the West Kootenay Women's Association. We've operated in Nelson and area for 13 years now. We run the Nelson Women's Center, which is a general drop-in center and has got tons of information on every women's issue we can get our mitts on. And we also run Kootenay Women Works, which is an employment project for women and operates out of downtown Nelson. I think one of the most important things when we're talking about defining patriarchal culture is that we have to remember that we live in it. And we really can't see it objectively. It is in our minds, it's in our hearts, it's in our souls. And the more I work as a feminist, the more I realize just how deep the oppression of women goes. What all the right-wing people warn you about when they say, oh, those feminists, they really want to revolutionize the world, they're right, we do. We want to challenge what is in your hearts about what women are and what men are. And the analogy I would use for patriarchal culture as opposed to what is not patriarchal is that if we were all aquatic animals living in this ocean environment, which I'll call patriarchal, and out there is this air environment, which is the unknown. And it's as if feminists are those first animals that ventured out onto the land. And you could imagine all the other animals would be saying, now come on, what do you want to go out there for? It's comfortable down here now. You go out there, you don't know what's going to go on, but go ahead, you'll find out what it's like, and then when you come back, you'll really appreciate the way it is here now. And when I think about the women who fought so hard in the beginnings, well, throughout all the thousands of years of patriarchal culture, and the women who are struggling now, we get a lot of messages like that. And sometimes you do want to just give up and slip back. I think, as the other speakers have said, the image of God as a man is one that feminists come up against time and time again because it's yet another manifestation of how we think about our roles. If God is a man, what then are women? And in the same sense that as we embody God as a white European man, and we use that to come and invade the cultures of non-Western nations. For example, in Canada, I think it makes it easier if you have a strong conviction that God is somebody who looks just like you as a Western European. It makes it easier to come in and destroy the culture and the religion of Native Canadians. And I think in the same sense that the embodiment, that the image of God as man has been used in many ways to oppress women. I think that what we need to be mindful of is the ways that patriarchal culture is manifesting itself now here in British Columbia. And of all the many feminist issues that there are, the one that I think I picked on to talk about was motherhood. And it's because we have motherhood is something that is supposed to be sanctified in our culture, and yet the rights of mothers are very, very recent. Think about how many women in this room might have liked to have had one or two, say, their husbands in the delivery room when you had your children. Think of how recently that right has been won. Think about the fact that in Canada, we still don't have midwives. There are many, many rights we've only just won in the last 10 years. Rights for mothers are very, very fragile. And I think that we are going to see with new technology, new medicine, even more threats to the rights of mothers. And I refer, yesterday's Nelson Daily News had a write-up on the case of baby R in Vancouver. That was a case where a fetus, an unborn child, was apprehended by our provincial government. Don't make the mistake of talking about the social worker or the lawyer or the doctor. It's our government that is doing this. And the law that is going to be applied in this case applies to all mothers. Yet, we have not even begun to address these issues. What about advanced medical techniques? What about cesarean sections? Except, excuse me, my throat is quite dry, except in special groups, our culture does not talk about these issues. We haven't addressed these issues in Parliament. We haven't constructed laws to try and take care of the rights of women versus the rights of unborn children. Yet we are having, through the back doors, the courts are making decisions, are being asked to make decisions that will affect all parents, mothers, and fathers, and all those decisions are based on the worst possible cases. Now think about it. The United States has the highest rate of cesarean sections in the world. Canada has the second highest rate. There are many credible medical people who say our cesarean rate is too high. I recently read an article by a doctor that said, well, the problem is, doctors are afraid of lawsuits, so if it comes down to having a cesarean section or not, they'll just go ahead and do the cesarean section. That's what this current issue is about. And if the courts pass a law that says, yes, a baby can be apprehended, a woman can be apprehended, and she can be held, and the kind of maternal care she wants to give can be dictated, where does it stop? Why could you not apprehend mothers to prevent home births? What about mothers who smoke? What about mothers who drink? What about the borderline medical issues? I'd like to touch on another issue with respect to our companies. Now, we take these disadvantaged mothers and we say, and this is a very, very bad case, by the way. This is a mother who's had 4 children apprehended. She has problems with mental health. She has a problem, apparently, with alcohol. It's not a case where you may want to return the child to the mother. And so we look at this, and it's very easy to say, oh, well, yes, she's a terrible mother, and, maybe in this case, she should be told what to do with her baby. But let's look at how we treat companies, the companies that manufacture DES, the companies that manufacture the pill, the companies that manufacture the Dalcon Shield. Many of these birth control methods have been found to be detrimental to women and to children. Thank you very much. Some of these companies, when it's after years and years of research, their products are found to be harmful to women and children. They take the products off the North American shelves, they sell them in the third world. DES, which is no longer being marketed in Canada, is still being sold. And by the way, DES is a drug that was given in order to prevent miscarriages. It has resulted in cancer, in abnormalities of the reproductive organs of the sons and the daughters of the women who took it. We're now finding out it may have caused problems in the granddaughters of the women who took it. That drug is still being used in some circumstances in Canada. It's not supposed to prevent miscarriages, but it is being used in other circumstances, and it is being marketed in the third world still under the same conditions. It is still being marketed as a drug to prevent miscarriages. But what do we do to these companies compared to how we are now treating these disadvantaged women? When we say to these companies, where millions of people may have been affected, the first thing they do is they say, well, gee, now let's look at this. First of all, you've got to really prove that this chemical really caused this harm. Where disadvantaged women are taken by the court system and being told what to do, companies use our patriarchal court system to avoid the responsibility. And the other thing they like to say is, oh, well, come on now, all life is full of risks. You've got to take a few risks. You can't even cross the street without being hit by the car. So, I mean, really, if you want these medical advances, you're going to have to take your knocks. And I think they're right. I think that we can't guarantee a perfect birth. But it's an interesting thing of how the argument for, well, we want to have a perfect birth, is used against the wishes and desires of mothers in our culture, but not against the medical profession and the companies, which are still manufacturing drugs, and we have to question whether they're adequately tested. And we have this situation now where there's a huge amount of power being manifested. And one of the interesting side effects, we deal with a lot of mothers and mothers' rights at the Women's Centre, is that these different mothers look at the system, they look at the court system, the power it has, they look at the power of doctors, they look at the power of social workers, and they get suspicious. And they don't want to cooperate because they think there's just too much power, and they make wrong decisions. And our response, more often than not, the response of our culture is to punish those women for being suspicious. And I was trying to think, well, what is this? I mean, we're just going to say, well, it's just a terrible thing and people are just awful to each other. And I think the essence of this is, what is birth and what are children in a patriarchal culture? If a patriarchal culture enshrines man is what is humanity. When a patriarchal culture wants to perpetrate the immortality of man, then children are not persons in their own right. They're the manifestation of the immortality of men, and women are the vessels of that immortality. And that's the way in which you deny the rights of mothers. That's the way in which some cases we say the rights of the unborn child is more important than the rights of the mothers. So where we want to go, or I think where the feminist movement is working towards, is first of all to continually bring out the experiences of women. The Bishop Remi De Roo mentioned you can't express what you haven't experienced, and I agree. But the other thing is, if you prevent a significant faction like women from expressing, then you're not going to know about our experiences. I saw a wonderful video called Firewords by Studio D, and it was French-Canadian women who were writers, and they were talking about the acceptance of women writers and women artists, women painters, and that the emergence, and of course the thing that was often said when women went to express, the response was, well, you know, women really can't write, women really can't paint, women have to get their validation from men. And one of the analogies offered by the women, she said, you know, it's as if they stuck women down in a well that was full of nothing but molasses, and the women were there struggling trying to write. And they struggle to write down in this well where they've been put, and then the male critics come along and say, well, you know, these women are no good as writers. All they can write about is molasses. So what are we going to do with that? We need to go much, much further in putting forth our perspective, our experiences. I think we need to continue to be radical. If some of what I say about the rights of mothers makes you feel uncomfortable, it is an indication that these are the issues we really need to resolve and address. And please, let's do it in an intelligent, let's make a plan about the rights of mothers and not agree to an ad hoc approach, the way we're having it now. Where I'd like to go is to see our spiritual point of view come to encompass all of life. And I think in the many different ways as feminists manufacture new spiritual concepts, and we'll be seeing some of this at Vatican Hall at the Women's Festival this weekend. What we want to do is take away that egotism of our spiritual aspect that says we, the people, are more important than all other life on the planet. We'd like to see a spirituality that says the world is what the world is. Let's not worry about us coming in as human beings and making the world perfect. The world is perfect. And our job here is to make the best life we can for all of us without damaging others. And I really think that if we want to survive and if we want to do the best we can for the world, for all of us, men and women, that it's helpful to start thinking about what if I was to treat all other forms of life as just as important as me, because it is. As a reporter, I attend an awful lot of hearings about the use of pesticides, and I see people come up time and time again, and they ask, what is going on with these chemicals? We don't know. What's happening? I think if we realize that we're part of the world, and we depend upon it, and we're no more important, we wouldn't be leaving these big questions behind us. And I think that's as much as I want to say now. I think that for women, we will need to challenge you in such a way to continue to make you think about the very roots. And that means, I think, in this ecumenical forum, thinking about the very roots of Christianity, of Judaism, of all religions. Going right down to the nitty-gritty, and in every place saying, if I use the word man, what happens if I substitute the word woman? And if it is a different quality when you do that, then that's a place, from my point of view, where you have to continue to work. And I guess the thing I'd like to say in conclusion is that one of the things I realized from trying to work on what should I say here is that I think the one thing we've all got in common is that you can't work as a feminist, and you can't work as anybody working to change the world unless you have a basic faith in the goodness of all people. And one of the things I realized is that as a working feminist, I have faith in mankind, and I mean the men here, as much as I have faith in womankind. Because if I didn't have that faith that we could reach out to the goodness in all of us here, I couldn't work as a feminist. I'd have to give up.
Before I ask Vicki to speak, I'd like to ask your permission now to run overtime as we have, to run overtime another 7 minutes. And then if we can go quickly to the groups. And am I right, Irene, in saying that people who haven't a group that they are part of, should they meet here at the front? Okay, so as soon as we're finished here, people who aren't a part of a group, come up to the front. Okay, thanks, Vicki.
I feel very charged by what I've heard so far. I'm sure you have too. I plan to be brief, and so I will be. My interest is in the relationship between what's been called the public sphere and the private sphere. Culturally, we have developed the notion that there is private life. Usually the family is the center of that. And much of that is nobody else's business, thank you, but those people immediately involved. And then we have public life, which for the most part has, males have disproportionately been involved in public life in terms of decisions, politics, etc. And feminist strategies that I'd call liberal strategies during the 70s were to start to push women into the public sphere. Simone de Beauvoir talked about childbirth as nature's cruel trap. Women were to push that aside and get out there and become bishops, maybe perhaps not bishops, but you name it, positions of authority, politicians, take up their sphere in the public life and move out of the private. Feminists are now critiquing that, and so do I. I think it's a two-way street. It's not enough to push women out there into the public sphere, but it's time to bring men into what's been called the private sphere and thoroughly integrate them into the responsibilities of raising children, domestic things, right from ground up, and at the same time working to dissolve that boundary between the public and the private. I think we've overly privatized life. Dorothy Dinnerstein is a very interesting feminist who says at a very early age, children, if you like, think with their emotions. The rational isn't developed yet. And if the only voice they hear consistently is the voice of the female, that's the voice they're going to hold responsible for the rest of their lives. It's called blame mother syndrome. I still do it myself. It's the voice who disciplined, who gave you good things, who gave you bad things, who did that day-to-day nitty-gritty stuff. If the voice of the male is absent and it appears later on when the child has more of a rational mindset, the male voice is the voice of reason, the mediator, the conciliator, etc. And she makes a case saying that the child needs to hear equal voices at a very early age to develop into being a whole personality, a whole person, a non-sexist human being. As a challenge, as Premika said, that her father had entered into, and I have a hope for fatherhood there. Mary O'Brien said that she'd like to see the working face of paternity as much as she'd like to see the working face and hands of maternity. I'd like to close with an anecdote from my experience as a minister in the United Church. Away from the lofty realms of radical feminism, I was in a fairly small town in northern Saskatchewan, and I worked a lot with younger women with toddlers, preschool children. These were not radical feminists. They were not poor women. And over time, a group of women volunteered to put on some very high-quality family life programs in the congregation, and everybody thought this was just fine. We were getting to have quite a good reputation as being a place where young families could come, find some good programs. It's hard work to plan these programs. It takes quality planning time. And some of these women, most of the women on this small committee, some of them had 3 children under 6. And it's pretty hard to have a quality discussion with toddlers running around and interrupting every 5 minutes, etc. So we solved that problem by hiring a childcare person. In fact, the same person who came every Wednesday morning for a Bible study I led. We paid her well. This was a vocation she chose. She looked after our children well, and for an hour and a half, we planned in peace the family life programs for the church. And we decided we'd send the bill to the congregation. After all, we were spending our time anyway, and so a bill of $40 was sent for childcare to the Board of Stewards. Those of you in the United Church might know how that works. A group called stewards in some congregations, mostly men, maybe it's not fair to say in some congregations, make the financial decisions, and a group called session, under the old system, make other decisions. Anyway, this was the hottest item on the agenda that night. Already $10,000 had been set aside for a stained glass window, but they decided not to pay the $40 babysitting, I've said that word again, childcare bill. And the reason wasn't this generation of women spoiled? I mean, why couldn't they plan a church do with toddlers running around? Besides, we were paying our childcare worker too much. Well, I was madder than hell, and rarely do I get that way, so I marched down to the chairperson's office. He worked for the government, and mind you, he didn't plan his work with toddlers around. The secretary protected him and answered the phones, and he invited me into his office, and we actually got along very well, but I was mad about this one. And he said, "You shouldn't have paid her that much, and besides, why didn't you ask my wife? She would have been glad to have done it for free." At which point, I thought, Anyway, we continued this. Instead of treating it like a trivial, petty issue, it became a fairly big deal. The women didn't give up. They felt quite insulted. We took it to the Christian Education Committee. This is high politics by this time. And set off all kinds of discussions. And the Christian Education Committee suggested a strategy. They would ask for a budget for our committee for $100 or $200 a year from the stewards, which then we could spend as we wished, which of course we spent on childcare so we could have good planning time, etc. I was amazed at the energy that issue aroused. I've been to Nicaragua and back, and that didn't arouse the kind of interest that this $40 childcare bill did. It's amazing. And this included women of different generations, this included men, and it became a justice issue, which got all kinds of things going. But the bottom line thing is, if we say the church is a family, we need to value the labor that it takes to plan that family and create quality life for that family. And that's not assuming that women are going to volunteer their time like they used to. Some may, and that's fine and well, but I think we need to look at valuing that which we participate in, and that includes that which has been, quote, in the private sphere as well as the public sphere. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Vicki. So if
carried out, it was made mandatory and not voluntary. And I think they increased the percentage of minorities as defined by their program by 20% in a period of 5 years.
the comment from this group goes along with that question. It says, the women in our group have all felt the pressures of patriarchal society, but see this pressure diminishing today. There seem to be more equal partner relationships, they said. The next question from group 14 is to Tish. It says, you stated that we are not striving to make a more perfect world. The world is perfect. Would you please explain what you mean by this?
I'm thinking here of the world as a whole, the world as, and especially the interlocking balance of life, the way the plants relate to the atmosphere, relate to the minerals in the soil. It's the only world we've got. So if we think there's not enough resources in the world, my answer is the resources are what the resources are. And the world has gotten along very, very well for billions of years, and I think we've got to take a look at that. I'll give you an example from forestry as to how we've tried to interfere. Our natural forest stands in British Columbia are all mixed species. They tend to be mixed species. One of the things that happened when we started planting trees and believing that, well, we know better, we want one stand, it'll be more economical. So we imposed our economic standards on our natural forests, and we planted single stands of species like pine. And then what we had was disease would go right through the forest, and I think what the Forest Service is doing now, and when I just finished planting trees, which I did for 8 years, they were finally getting around to having the planters mix their species, so we planted more than one kind of species. And it's an interesting thing that as we look at the world, is how we've tried to interfere with the workings of the world, that we're increasingly having to come back to the way the world has functioned. And that's what I mean in that way.
Does that answer helpfully the people who asked that question? Yeah, good answer. Fanny, you didn't need that, did you? Is feminism, this is from group 7 and 8, is feminism a sexist word, and is there an alternate term? Does anybody want to?
Well, I'll start. I don't think it's a sexist term at all. I think you have male and female feminists, just as you have male and female chauvinists. And it's the value system that goes with it.
We're done, right?
We're done.
Okay. Question from,
Just I don't want to let the panel get off so easily off the hook. Because part of our question was that we spend a lot of time working on the word feminism and feeling that there's a lot of misconception in the word feminism and due to perceptions of the press, etc. So we're trying to come, is there another way to express more of a sense of wholeness?
Maybe you could create one yourselves, like what you feel.
We spend now trying to
Okay, the comment from that group also is, as a group of women and men, we must all work together to transcend the dualities of private, public, male, and female. Question from group 11. How do we change the basis of our values to recognize not just monetary contributions, but contributions to quality of life? Okay. Maybe I'll read the question and the statement in case there's some clarification there. How do we change the basis of our values to recognize not just monetary contributions, but contributions to quality of life? Quality of life. And statement, we need to affirm the progress we have made in the dismantling of patriarchy as means of continuing to press for the completion of the goal. Okay, and the question is about changing values and not just valuing maybe economic, valuing money and maybe capitalist venture. Remi.
I may not be responding directly to the question as such, but for me that question opens a very serious and a very contemporary issue, and that's the issue of work. I think we have an illustration here of how conditioned our Western culture has become by a very narrow understanding of economics. And that narrow understanding is now imposing itself pretty well on the whole globe. We're all operating basically under a global market economy system where human initiative and human work has been reduced in terms of values to the dollar sign. And the only thing that's really valued in the market economy is that which produces money. In other words, jobs that make money. Any job that does not make money is systematically undervalued. The classic example is parenting. Tell me, is there an activity in the world that is more important in terms of economics than parenting? Where would we be if there was no parenting? I mean, it's the very basis. And yet, in the global market economy, parenting is not rewarded, it is punished. And the struggles that women have, and men as well, for leave, for instance, for parents, is an illustration. And people who are working and who assume the responsibility of parenthood in the course of their job are actually made to feel guilty. They're a nuisance. She interrupted her job, you see, to have a baby. And that's a nuisance for the company. That shows you how those values have been completely distorted. Now, this is not easy to deal with in a short statement. I just want to leave it with you as a thought. One of the most important things that you and I have to face is a revaluing of work, the idea of work. We have to reclaim the value of work in all its creative expressions. And we have to get out of this trap of the narrow economic definition of work. And it's very serious for two reasons. First of all, because the whole of our economy and our culture and our whole political system, our whole society is really the result of work. And those few powerful people who are making money from the economy and as a result running our lives just to fit their maximization of profits don't have a right to dictate to us. So we need to claim back our right to do creative work and to have a recompense for that, to have that creative work recognized. Parents, for instance, artists, nothing more important than the work of artists. They're the ones who help us prepare for the future and understand the limitations of our present system, and yet they are not recognized. Our artists starve. The other reason, which may be even more practical, is that we've built a whole society, a whole world, on the linkage between jobs and economic survival. But we're in the process with the technical revolution, technology, high-tech, etc., of getting into a situation where most of the commodities that we use, consumer goods, could be produced by a minority of the population because of robots, etc., high-tech. So what's happening is that if we continue to tie so closely our whole economic well-being with simple production of commodities, you're going to end up with a smaller and smaller proportion of the population producing the commodities, and everybody else dependent for survival on some kind of a redistribution that's not based on paid work, but based on charity. However you call it, family allowances or old age pensions or health or security, unemployment insurance, whatever the system, it's basically creating dependent people. We shouldn't have to have welfare or old age pensions or all these so-called, this safety net. The welfare safety net, useful as it is itself a trap because it makes too many people dependent on the government and on a tiny minority. Even the minimum wage is a trap. Because if you set a minimum wage, which is basically handouts from the government, guaranteed minimum income, you also give the power to the government to reduce that income to below the poverty level, which is already happening. You see what I'm trying to say? We have to restore the right to work to everyone and the right to receive an adequate salary for any kind of occupation which is creative for the common good, not just that which maximizes the profits of the investors. That's the major revolution we have before us, and it's urgent, because otherwise we're going to end up with a smaller and smaller elite of upwardly mobile people who hold their jobs and their security, and a greater majority of people who are downwardly mobile, including our middle class that is slipping, lower and lower wages, and more dependency on a government. And that's a formula for disaster.
And yet I'd like to add a word, because I think that women have some things to teach to men, because so many of us have never been employed or have been employed for only certain periods of our lives. My observation is that many men have received their identity from their job, from their work, and so when they retire, they either drop dead or they don't know what to do with themselves. And but they've lost their identity. They don't know what to do, and their wives wish they go back to work or something. And that there are things to be learned there, that life is possible and in fact is very good, sometimes apart from paid employment.
I hear lots of laughter indicating recognition. The question from groups 11 and 12. Kim, got another one?
Oh, sorry. Shelley,
Oh, timely. The question from group 11 and 12 is, can people assume positions of power, getting things done, without being tainted by the patriarchal society in which they reside? Now, the comment that goes with that is that the patriarchal society does not necessarily provide freedom for the male. It often entraps him and limits his opportunity to enjoy a full life. Can people assume positions of power without being tainted by the patriarchal society?
My answer is no.
I think that's true, because we still don't know. I think the best we can do is keep asking ourselves questions as we take positions of power and be willing to listen to the people that we have power over.
Well, it depends on one's definition of power, too. I mean, if power means control over somebody else, then the answer is no. If power means the possibility of enhancing human relationships, then the answer is maybe. I mean, our only conception of power, apparently, is to control somebody else, and that's why if they don't shape up, you bash them. I mean, violence is really okay in our society, right through. And that's not my understanding of what power can be, but I think power is very important because it does mean the possibility of change. So I'd say maybe. Let's try it.
Question from group 5 and 6. We would like Remi to address how his interpretation of the text from Genesis, God created the male and female, is accepted by his Roman Catholic peers. Could you in particular comment on the maleness of the clergy?
Well, really, we've got two major problems there, and we shouldn't confuse the two. The first question is, could you repeat the wording, please?
We would like Remi to address how his interpretation of the text from Genesis, God created the male and female, is accepted by his Roman Catholic peers.
Okay, some of the most advanced thinking and writing that I have read in that area comes from Roman Catholic scholars, women and men. Incidentally, if you would like a review of some of the best thinking in a very contemporary setting, I would recommend a brand new book by Leonardo Boff, and the title is The Maternal Face of God. The Maternal Face of God, Leonardo Boff. Now, what he does there, Boff, as you know, is one of the better-known Latin American theologians. He does a complete review of the whole feminist situation, obviously coming out of the Roman Catholic tradition. But in the process, he does a really masterful summary. It will save you reading half a dozen books. And he goes right at the heart of that central issue of the concept of God and makes, for me, the best case I've read yet of expressing the femininity of God. In fact, that's his whole thesis. Yeah? To bring into value the maternal face of God. In other words, the feminine expression of God. A very, very powerful book. So I would say, I could start naming people like Schussler, Fiorenza, and all these other scholars who are really redoing our studies of the scriptures and so forth. Just to say there's an awful lot happening. It's a very exciting field. Boff, B-O-F-F. Leonardo. There are two Boffs, B-O-F-F. There's Clovis and Leonardo. I think they're brothers. They're Latin American theologians. You can find that in any religious bookstore. The title is The Maternal Face of God. Obviously won't be confused with any other title because I don't think there are two books on that topic. The second question, would you read it again? Yeah, if you want to read that again?
Okay. Could you in particular comment on the maleness of the clergy?
Okay, the maleness of clergy. Okay, at the sociological level, obviously, there's a huge argument in terms of equality. And from the human rights sociological point of view, there's no doubt that there's a major problem. But that problem is still hung up on a pre-Vatican II understanding of the concept of clergy. I sometimes put it this way. The whole question of clergy and ordination is evolving very rapidly. If I was a woman, I wouldn't want to struggle so that I end up tomorrow being yesterday's priest. Now, it's like a moving train. You know, if you jump at a moving train, you end up behind the train. And as I watch this scene evolving now in the Roman Catholic Church as well as elsewhere, that whole question of ministry and ordination is moving so rapidly that we have to be careful not to be dealing with yesterday's concepts. I know a lot of women who just would not want to be ministers in yesterday's situation. So really what we're witnessing now in the Roman Catholic tradition, and all this started with the Vatican II, and it's only begun to move, but it's starting to move very rapidly now, is an evolution of the whole concept of ministry and a resituation of orders within that concept of ministry. See, part of the problem is that people identified ministry and orders as if the only valid ministry was orders, and forgot that the ordained ministry is only one expression of ministry. There's a synod, as you know, on laity coming up in Vatican this fall, and they're going to be right on top of that issue, because we have to redefine the whole question of ministry, and we have to get it out of the clerical trap, because a lot of people in the Roman Catholic tradition have the impression that the only valid ministry is the ministry done within the parish. In other words, the clerical ministry. And that's really a minor factor in terms of the real responsibility of the church, which is to reach out to the whole of society. And I know there's a shadow side to that too, but I'm just trying to illustrate that it is a vastly, rapidly moving field.
I just wanted to add something, just in terms of institutionalized religions. I think that one doesn't have to wait to hear that it's okay. If you feel that something needs to change, I think it's all religions are made up of people, and if you decide that it should be different, decide that it is different. We're always waiting generally for other people to tell us whether it's okay or whether it's all right, or is this what we should be thinking, whether it's science or religion and stuff like that. Just a comment.
I'd like to make a comment on the femaleness of clergy. One of the dilemmas for female clergy is whether to cut themselves a piece of the pie or whether to really be instrumental in baking a whole new cake.
The comment from this group was, our group feels like we need to be rushed into this slowly. There's no ambivalence there. We need time for change, but we also need the radical leaders to counter the apathetic sector.
If I may just follow up on what Lois said, I'm glad Lois raised that aspect. I think it is really a question of baking a whole new cake.
Oh, I do too.
Because if I may be allowed this observation as a Roman Catholic looking at the other Christian churches, I don't see how the ordination of women in the other Christian churches has really solved the problem. Because the problem lies much deeper than ordination. It's that whole culture question. In fact, there is a danger that if you just take the superficial solution and say, okay, let's ordain a whole bunch of women ministers, is that what you're going to do is ordain them into a second-class ministry and lock them culturally into that perpetually, and you'll be no better off. And I'm not offering that as a cop-out for the problem in the Roman Catholic Church, but I'm just saying the problem is much deeper than the narrow focus on just ordination, where you end up with a piece of the pie instead of, creating a whole new thing.
But simply to say that there are many women aware of that, and give us 20 years, and I think you'll see a different shape to the church.
Good.
It's interesting that we need our ministers in the Protestant tradition, need our sisters in working in the Catholic tradition, because there's a clarity of issues that you see when you see the women professors working in the Catholic colleges and what they're doing there, and when you're a Protestant woman minister going through. There's a good interplay between those groups of people. And with the men there as well. I'm going to leave the second question for group 5 and 6 so we can get to some of the others and then turn around if we have time. Is that all right with that group? Okay, question from group 9 and 10. As a member of a faith community, what do you do when the person who has the power and the authority is unable or unwilling to move from a rigid patriarchal position?
You have a revolution.
Any comments? Any comments from the floor?
I'd like to comment on that, and I'd like to disagree. You don't start your own church because you're going to recreate the same problem. I think the solution runs much deeper than a structural solution, because create your own church means form another structure. You're still in the same culture, and you're going to see that culture is going to impose the same problems on your structure. I'm suggesting the problem runs much deeper than that.